All the women in a row?
Okay. Gone Americans to Europeans with a Brit in the middle. It's great.
It wasn't intended that way, though. You want to mix them up? No.
David, are you starting? Or do you want me to start? Yeah, you start. Well, that's what we agreed.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry, I think I've got two mics. So try and switch this one off. My name is David O'Sullivan. I'm the European Union Ambassador to the United States, and I'd like to welcome you all. I'm going to make just a few brief remarks. This is part of a series which we felt in the delegation we would try to put together in the run-up to the presidential and congressional elections. We were in Cleveland last week, so we're strictly non-partisan, where we had a similar panel. We're having one here, and we hope to organize in DC a follow-up panel in early December, taking into account the outcome of the elections and how we can have transatlantic issues on the agenda of the new administration and the new Congress. The basic purpose here was to fly the European flag during this week when obviously there is an intense amount of debate about this country and its future, but just to remind people about the importance of transatlantic relations, and that's really what the purpose of the panel. I'd like to thank you all for being here. I know it's going to be a bit stressful to fit everything in between now and the getting to the convention center for the speeches tonight. I'd like to thank NDI very warmly for working with us very closely on this event and for all that they do. Indeed, it's a huge privilege for all of us from outside the United States to witness this fantastic exercise of democracy, which is this every four-year event. It's the greatest piece of political theater, I think, in the world, and we're very grateful to the United States for putting that on. Though, of course, we do realize that it does have consequences, and it's not purely entertainment. And indeed, we were so jealous of the amount of publicity the United States was getting, we organized a small thing called Brexit in Europe just to distract a little bit. But I'm afraid even still, I think the US is going to be pretty much center stage for the next few months. I would just like to mention a few points. Firstly, Federica Mogherini had really hoped to be here, and I should not actually be speaking, it should be she, but she was detained in Brussels and will only arrive later this evening, so unfortunately she could not be on the panel. And Congressman Meeks, who very generously had agreed to be here, also had convention duties with the Black Caucus and unfortunately sent his regrets. I'm very grateful that Jay Newton-Small of Time Magazine has joined us. She, among her many qualifications, is the author of a very interesting book to which I commend your attention called Broad Influence and How Women Are Changing the Nature of Work in America. And since we now have officially the first woman candidate for president from a major party. This is a very topical book, and I know that Jay has also talked a lot with Hillary Clinton about her plans. There will be a reception afterwards, and there will also be buses to take you from here to the convention center, and the staff outside will be able to help. Matt is going to mastermind and organize the conversation. I'm very conscious, I'd like to thank our panelists. Matt will briefly mention them in a moment. I'm also conscious that there are many people in the audience who could have been on this panel. We have a number of other distinguished guests from the European Parliament, and unfortunately we couldn't have a completely representative cross-sample of the European Parliament on the panel. And we have a number of very distinguished guests from our member states, of course, including ministers and members of national parliaments, and they're very welcome. We've organized this in such a way that we will give everyone the opportunity to participate in a more open discussion after an initial exchange with the panels. And we will be very indulgent of those people I've just mentioned who wish to make statements with a question mark at the end if that's what they feel they need to do. So thank you very much indeed, and with that I'll ask Matt to conduct our conversation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you to the audience for joining, and also to my fellow panelists. In addition to the Ambassador and Jay, who the Ambassador has already introduced, I have to my left Julianne Smith, who is at CNAS now, but in a previous life or previous part of her life has been a national security advisor to Vice President Biden, and is also part of the Hillary Clinton foreign policy team. On my right, we have the Europeans. That starts with Esther de Lange, who is the Vice Chair of the European People's Party. And we have also Gianni Pittella, who is the president of the chair of the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats in the European Parliament. I thought what we would try to do over the course of the next hour is really to answer three questions. The first is, what is the future of the EU? The second is, how do we politically revitalize the transatlantic relationship? And the third is a set of multiple questions, which is, what will be the central policy pillars or central tenets of a new and reinvigorated transatlantic relationship? But I think let's go to the first, the future of the EU. The ambassador mentioned Brexit, but beyond that, we have seen the rise of a kind of anti-European populism and populism across the European continent. So, Gianni, I wondered if you wanted to share your thoughts a little bit on how we tackle that and how we make sure that the EU is fit for purpose and how we can use that to build a basis for a future transatlantic relationship.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank Mr. Ambassador for inviting me and for organizing this important discussion. And yes, Europe has been infected by populism. The virus of populism, racism, xenophobia has affected Europe. And this virus has a name. The name is Le Pen in France, Farage in UK, Orban in Hungary, the Five Star Movement in Italy, Kaczynski in Poland. But you are not immune. You have the same virus in your society, and this virus is represented by Donald Trump. Yeah, it's very dangerous, the virus. You should not underestimate the risk of this virus. And I am also a doctor, not only politician. And I suggest you more attention to win this virus. Where this virus is coming from? In these last years, Europe has focused too much on banks and finance and too little on people. We have to make it clear that the power of democracy must overcome the power of finance. Globalization without controls and the policies of blind austerity brought about a worldwide economic crisis that has alienated citizens, in particular the middle class and the less well-off. This is a mistake we have made in Europe and in the US in the last decades. So, my answer is, what we have to do? First of all, we have to open a new phase to boost economy, to create new jobs, to reduce the unemployment, to reduce the hunger of the citizens. Secondly, we have to face the migration issue. Reaffirming our principle of the solidarity, because if EU loses this principle, it's not more EU, not more union. It is a reality an institution without soul, without values, without principles. So we have to welcome the migrants, the refugees, and we have to distribute these people in each country, 27 now, after the leaving of the UK. Third point, we have to fight the terrorism through security measures, but without changing the DNA of the EU. I think that a new economic policy, the capacity to face migration and terrorism, and the opening of a new social agenda, these are for me the priority of our action to change Europe and to save Europe. And I underline with joy that these priorities are also some priorities of the program, the political program of the Democratic Party in USA. And this, but I think that we will have the way to discuss after, but these convergences are very important for us, and these common points will reinforce our relationships.
Thank you, Johnny. Johnny's outlined what he sees as a program to revitalize trust and the strength of the European Union, and he says it's one that's shared by the Democratic Party in the United States. Is it one that's shared by the European People's Party, and do you see those similar? Do you see it have the same perspective?
Well, to a large extent. Of course, I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty detail. There are some things we disagree on. I don't think austerity, for example, caused the crisis in the EU. It was a necessary, unfortunately, remedy, but not the cause of the crisis. But that's detail compared to what we're discussing here. And Gianni is absolutely right on the issue of populism or isolationism in an international context, if you want to call it that way. But I might want to address actually the paradox that is now present within the EU when it comes to addressing the issues that Gianni mentioned. I agree with him. We need a real European migration policy. We need to address the issue of defense and defense cooperation in Europe as well. Spending at a national level, but also more cooperation at the European level. And the paradox is that we need this now more than ever. We don't have the clarity that the Cold War gave us. The world is much less predictable. We need this more than ever. Yet the basis, the political support to create this is less present than ever. And this is the conundrum that we're actually in. But I agree with Gianni. We need to deliver, and we need to deliver on those issues. And what was very surprising to me is that if you look at statistics of Eurostat, that also does the polls about what is the number one issue to people when it comes to making up their political mind, so to say. And indeed, Gianni, for years and years in Europe, that was the economy. And we've now seen a 13% leap within 1 or 2 years of people who now actually say, no, it's no longer the economy, although we're in a dire situation. We have much too high levels of youth unemployment, which is economically the first thing that we need to address. But now a majority of Europeans say the number one issue is no longer the economy, but it's security, and secondly, maybe migration. And we have a situation in which, just to give you an example, I come from a member state, the Netherlands, and you've heard of this attack that took place on the subway in Brussels. And as we found out later, we had one of the perpetrators of the Brussels attacks was flown out of Turkey, got to choose where he wished to land, and he opted for Amsterdam Airport. But the Dutch authorities lost him as soon as he set his feet on the ground. He could then go to Brussels, and the rest, unfortunately, is history. We only 5 or 6 countries in the EU do 90% of the sharing of intelligence when it comes to Syrian fighters returning to Europe. It's on those kind of issues that we need to get our act together and we need to deliver in order to regain this credibility with our people.
Thank you. Julianne, when we were talking in the preparation of this panel, you mentioned that in 2013, when you left government and were considering your options going to a think tank in Washington, people were trying to dissuade you from taking a European program job because they felt that nothing ever happened in Europe. So that's certainly not the case now. So I would love to hear your views on how you think some of the challenges that Esther and Gianni have laid out, how they can be met. But I'd also, in addition to that, like to ask you how you feel, from your own personal view rather than speaking for, but how you feel a future Clinton administration might differ in its approach or its interest in Europe as opposed to the current Democratic administration. I know that a lot of people have felt that the pivot to Asia during the early years meant that Europe may not have been the same priority, or it might not have been as instinctively as important for the president as it had in the past. So, your views on the future of Europe and also on how Secretary Clinton may approach would be really welcome.
Sure. Well, thank you to the European Union for the invitation today. It's great to be here. And so to take your first question, we made a number of assumptions in the Obama administration when I first went in 2009 about Europe in general. And those expectations mirrored a lot of what we were hearing from our European partners. And that is that while there were challenges, no doubt, particularly with the financial crisis and all the rest, generally we felt that Europe was on a very good path to being whole, free, and at peace, and that we had accomplished a lot together in the transatlantic space, and that we could afford the luxury of lifting our heads up and not navel-gazing just on the transatlantic relationship, and that we could, in essence, focus on a variety of crises around the world. And so off we went. And that was paired with my departure from the Obama administration in 2013, as you noted, when many folks said, don't go back and just work on Europe because there's not a heck of a lot going on. And you'll end up working on TTIP, but that's about it. And you're really a security person. And so you'll have to look in different regions of the world and consider other issue sets. And it made a little bit of sense to me, although I resisted being a good Europeanist, but now look at where we are. I mean, you can hardly look in any direction, and the transatlantic relationship is under attack from within, from external challenges, resurgent Russia, counterterrorism challenges, Brexit, rise of far-right parties or populist candidates. I mean, it just goes on and on and on, and it's hard to know where to begin to focus your attention. And so we've got work to do. And whoever wins this election, you know my bias, I hope it's Hillary Clinton, is going to have to simultaneously re-engage in the European project and the transatlantic relationship, while at the same time admitting to him or herself that the Middle East is also a mess and merits a great deal of U.S. political capital and resources and love and affection, as does the Asia Pacific. And so it will be a juggling act. The demands for reassurance are now very loud, coming from Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. And so this will be a challenge to reset the transatlantic relationship, put it on a better course, work together to deal with all of these challenges that we face, whether it's counterterrorism or what to do about Putin or how to cope now with Turkey after the coup and all the rest. And so this is going to require, in my mind, someone who has tremendous depth of expertise in the transatlantic relationship. And that takes me to Hillary Clinton. She is not Barack Obama. Barack Obama came into office labeling himself America's Pacific president because of his own set of experiences, because of his depth of knowledge, kind of his experience on the Hill, and before serving in Washington. And so that is in contrast to a Hillary Clinton that comes from a different generation and has a different set of experiences. I'm not passing judgment on one or the other, but I am here to say that Hillary Clinton is of the generation that I believe puts our transatlantic relationship at the heart of U.S. foreign policy. She's someone who has met endlessly with European leaders. She knows a lot of folks still in office, folks that have served in office that still remain highly influential. She understands the cultural and historical differences among various countries across Europe and regions. She knows the difference between the European Council and the European Commission and the European Parliament. Not many Americans do. She knows a lot about NATO. She's attended countless ministerials and summits. And so she has a very rich exposure. She could go on at length about the difference between Slovenia and Slovakia. And not many Americans can do that either. So this is someone who is comfortable talking about Europe, engaging with Europeans on the tough issues. She knows where we sometimes disagree. She knows where the challenges are. But I think if she were elected president, personally, as a good Europeanist myself, I would feel comfortable knowing that she was sitting in the chair. By contrast, to me, Donald Trump is the complete opposite. This is someone that is calling into question the core principles of our security guarantee to Europe, questioning the utility of Article 5 inside the NATO alliance, seemingly interested in cutting deals with President Putin, and I don't know what the implications of that would be for, say, Ukraine. And so it raises a lot of uncertain questions. I don't know his depth of knowledge. I don't think there's much on the transatlantic relationship, frankly. So I feel like from, broad national security, obviously I'm very comfortable with where Hillary Clinton sits on many of the issues facing us today as a country, but specifically on Europe and the transatlantic relationship, I believe that we're in good hands.
Thank you. Jay, you wrote a book called, the title... Yeah, and it was about how women are changing the way America works. And Julianne touched upon a number of the sort of biographical background issues that make Hillary Clinton such a strong candidate. I wonder, from the time you spent with her and the interviews you've done in doing that research, how you feel that her character will come to bear on a future transatlantic relationship, and particularly into the case where, with Theresa May now being the Prime Minister of the UK, Angela Merkel as a Chancellor, still the Chancellor of Germany, you would have 3 women in 3 of the most important countries, because I still believe Britain, despite Brexit, is an important country and will remain one. How that would shape the future of a transatlantic relationship?
So for my book, I interviewed Hillary Clinton, but I've also covered her for years, starting back when she was in the Senate. And just to give you a little background, my book actually grew out of the women of 3 years ago when we had the government shutdown in the States. It was actually the women of the Senate that came together to restart the negotiations to reopen the government when none of the men would talk to each other. And Hillary loved that article, and she actually wrote to me after that article and love the idea of women reaching critical mass. And so this is something that she's very familiar with, and the idea that somewhere between 20 and 30% in any institution, whether it's a legislature or a corporate board, a Navy ship, or an appellate court, women really begin to change the sort of culture of the institution and begin to change the way things are done. So that's what my book looks at. And I think, to your point, it's really fascinating to see the idea that you might have Hillary Clinton, Angela Merkel, and Theresa May, that would actually create critical mass in the G7. And what would it be like to have 3 women out of the 7 negotiators at the table, and how would the culture change there? We've never had anything like that before, and I think it really does begin to answer what happens when women rule the world. And we'll see. I think it's really fascinating. The only sort of studies that I can point to in my research, having done it, is that there's amazing studies that have been done by the 30% Club, which is out of Britain and Canada, and there's a small group here in the US that seeks to place at least 30% women on all corporate boards in America. And they have 2 studies that actually looks at what happens when you get to 30%, women on corporate boards and how they function differently. And their results were that men actually the male corporate board members had to start coming to the table better prepared and do their homework more. Because the women were so much better prepared than they were. So it'll be interesting to see if this will happen with Angela Merkel and potentially Hillary Clinton and Theresa May going into the G7 meetings. It's a different level, obviously, but it is, I think, really interesting and really crucial to get critical actors, female critical actors into these kinds of roles. It's because only then you really see the proliferation of women in the workforce. And that is, I think, very important across the board. In Europe, you had quotas, which brought lots of women into the workforce. In the US, that's unlikely. When I was interviewing Hillary Clinton about what she might do to bring more women into the workforce, she argued that she would govern differently as a woman versus a man because of her life experience as a mother and someone who's experienced a lot of sexism. But she also said that she would work to bring more women into the workforce, not only in the public sector. She said half her cabinet would be women. They're trying to make half of her political appointees, which would be 2,000 out of 4,000 people, women. But she also really wanted to work to bring more women into the private sector, and so create something along the lines of the 30% Club in the UK or the Male Champions for Change initiative in Australia, sort of unfortunately named, that she... here in the United States, that would sort of challenge the private sector to bring more women into the workforce. So I think it would be a very certainly different presidency than we've ever seen, with a focus that is very different from anything that our previous male presidents have had. Although obviously Europe has had plenty of female leaders, and so perhaps that's our model. And when I did interview her, she said that her role model in the world was Angela Merkel, that she really admired her presidency.
Thank you. Thank you. Ambassador, you've been based here for well over a year now, and your full-time job is, invigorating the transatlantic relationship, representing European issues here. I wonder if you could share with us your view of where the sort of green shoots of hope are for strengthening the relationship. Looking towards the next administration, where would you like to see greater collaboration and a strengthening of this transatlantic relationship?
Well, I think we do have a broadly shared agenda across the major challenges we face, which have been very well enumerated by a number of the panelists already. Whether they're economic, commercial, security, global challenges. We haven't talked, for example, about climate change, which I think is an area where we've worked very well together. So I think we would hope that with the next administration we can engage on the full range of these issues. I think what I would like to see, speaking as the European Union ambassador, and member state ambassadors, some of them are in the audience. I'm sorry, I can't actually see who's in the audience because the lights are glaring. I would like to see slightly more engagement with the European institutions. And I think this links the point of transatlantic relations and the future of Europe. I agree entirely with what Mr. Pittella and Mr. Lange said about the challenges we face, and we face some very real challenges of the acceptance of many of our citizens of what we have built and how we take this European project forward. I do think that what gets lost in some of the noise is the enormous achievement of the institutions and what we've achieved, and the difference between building the European Union and, say, the WTO or the United Nations or other international organizations. We have really tried to build something which is a hybrid. All the more difficult to sell to people, I understand, but all the more valuable. And I do worry sometimes that some of the talk, and I hear it often here in Washington, people saying, well, actually, we need to engage with Europe, but we need to engage more with individual countries and less with Europe as a bloc. I understand the temptation. If I were an American policymaker, maybe I would be tempted to do that as well. But I think we also need an American policy that reinforces what we have built collectively in Europe and the institutional structure and what we do together. And we need to find ways of managing that we will continue to have, each member state will continue to have very important bilateral relations with the United States. And I know from my fellow ambassadors in Washington how hard they work to develop that. But I do think there is value added in the European Union as such. If you look at the issue of Russia, Ukraine, the sanctions against Iran, what we were able to do in the Iran nuclear deal, this was very much the European Union as such able to add value both in economic and commercial terms, but also, and obviously the trade negotiations, I hope, will not get lost sight of if we haven't concluded by this year. So that would be my wish with the next administration if that were possible.
Okay, thank you. Julianne, You said that Hillary Clinton knows the difference between the European Council and the Council of Europe and is familiar with all the institutions. But Jay has said that her the politician she admires most is Angela Merkel. So what's the likelihood of a Hillary administration wanting to deal more with the European institutions rather than seeing Berlin as the number to call when you wanted to call Europe?
Well, the United States has faced this challenge from day one. It's always been, how do we balance our interest in seeing the European Union succeed and cooperating closely with the European Union, but also appreciating the fact that we have to carry on with our bilateral relationships as well, and many countries want that. So we have to do both, and I don't think it's an either-or choice. I do think that in my time in government, I saw many instances of Washington immediately asking the question when a crisis would erupt, what does Berlin think? And I think, frankly, that's changed over the years. It is still, what does also London and Paris think? There is an emphasis on the big three, but I've seen a little more emphasis in recent years on Germany, given Merkel's role, than I have, frankly, on the UK and France. And so what I would guess that you would see, I mean, I can't know for sure, from Hillary Clinton as the next U.S. president is someone that would be able to balance those two, enhancing our bilateral relationships, staying close to our friends in Berlin and Paris and London, among other key cities, but also reinvesting in the European Union as an institution. I think there's deep concern, frankly, on all sides about the future of the European project. And I think Americans, by and large, I can't speak for Donald Trump, but many Americans feel like it is in our interest as a country to continue to invest in that project. We're not a member, but we do believe that it is an institution that we care deeply about and that we've hopefully helped along one way or another. We've had a schizophrenic role too. I want to acknowledge that. I mean, particularly on foreign and defense policy. There are many times where we say we'd like to see more leadership from Europe, but not quite like that, you know, and it's hard to navigate some of those security relationships. That said, I think the U.S. has learned a lot about how valuable this partnership has been in recent years. We've witnessed with enthusiasm the growth in the EU's ambition to be more active in foreign and security policy. Many of us did read the new global strategy with great interest. I testified in Congress about the future of the EU some months ago, so there is interest. It's not a cast of millions, but those of us that work foreign policy and national security are interested in the European Union. We want to see it succeed. We want to support the project. We want to do our part and at the same time maintain close bilateral relations with many countries in Europe.
Thank you. Johnny, another point that the ambassador made was the need to sort of make a stronger political argument for the transatlantic relationship. I wonder, from your perspective as both an Italian Democrat and a leader of the Progressive Alliance in the European Parliament, how do you think we can better argue politically for the transatlantic relationship?
I think that this alliance, this transatlantic agenda, and I hope to enlarge this alliance. I think that the problems that we are facing deserve the efforts of many countries, not only EU and US, but also I hope Russia, China, Africa, even Iran, and the topics that our relationship has to face are, the ambassador already mentioned this, some of them. In my opinion, first of all, to reassure peace and stability in conflict areas. Syria, Libya, Eastern Europe, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Secondly, we have to act together after the situation in Turkey. We can't forget what happened in Turkey. The coup of state and direction of Erdogan. In my opinion, and I hope that Esther shares this opinion, the reaction of Erdogan is unacceptable, has been unacceptable, and is unacceptable. And I think that we have to react as US, EU, our alliance. Thirdly, terrorism. How it is possible to fight against terrorism alone? Trump is crazy when he proposes the strategy of the isolationism. He's crazy. He wants to bring this country in a disaster. It is possible to imagine USA isolated. This is my question to a USA citizen. It is possible? No. So, Trump is a liar. So, but the strategy of Trump is very, very simple. America is in a dramatic situation, but now I arrive and I solve everything. Do you remember Mussolini? But do you remember also the disaster made by Mussolini and your efforts to help us to build a democracy after Mussolini? Attention, be careful, my friends, be careful, because a wrong choice can create very hopeful situation for you. We need to reinforce our transatlantic agenda. We need a broad alliance to face terrorism, to fight terrorism, to create a sustainable development, fighting against the climate change, and I would like to conclude my short speech underlining the importance of the will of Hillary, just mentioned by Julian. Hillary wants to reinforce the relationship not only with Rome, London, Berlin, but with the EU. This is very important because we have, and I hope, and also on this topic, Esther shared my view, we have to win the concept of intergovernmental method in our side. Europe is a community, not a sum of states. Is the union of the states and the union of the citizens.
Can I respond to just a little bit to
Yeah,
that?
sure.
I spent, when I first came to Washington, my parents were both UN diplomats, and I think I was probably of the mindset of many expatriate kids growing up abroad, where I didn't quite understand why America was driven to do the crazy things that America was doing, like how could you not ratify the Human Rights Convention, which we wrote. And I think having spent 14 years now in Washington trying to figure that out, I just spent the afternoon in sort of right across the square in City Hall, listening to all the Bernie protesters talk all afternoon about how upset they were that Hillary didn't, that Hillary got the nomination, that Bernie didn't. And frankly, as the media, I think we were snobs about Donald Trump in the primary. Everyone thought he couldn't win. Everyone thought he's just a fad. Everyone thought he was entertainment and not politics. But there is an underlying movement here that is very powerful and very dangerous. And it is very angry. And you look at these protesters who are just across the square now in front of City Hall, and they are very afraid of Hillary, as much as they are of Trump, the Bernie folks, because they believe that she's going to drag them into more endless war. There's a lot of war weariness in the United States. They don't want to see us engaging in Syria, and they think that she's much more hawkish than Barack Obama was, and that Bernie Sanders would be. And when you ask them point blank, would you then vote for Hillary or for Trump come November, they say Trump, because he's an isolationist and he won't get their sons and daughters killed. So there is this, and it's not just that, it's obviously trade. There's a lot of anger and a fear about trade and incomprehension. Frankly, I think trade is probably the most misunderstood subject in the world. But I think it is really important to go out and talk and hear the grievances of a lot of these people to understand where they're coming from, because if we simply discount them as stupid or ignorant, and many of them are, but some of them are not, then we are failing ourselves as a country in not understanding this movement and understanding the people who are driving it. And they will elect somebody, and they have the power to elect control of Congress, for example, the Freedom Caucus, control of the speakership. And so it is important to begin to understand these powers that are so violently buffeting our government on so many sides. And it's frustrating because it's going to get so much worse before it gets better. This is... We're in the middle of a once-in-a-500-year disruption with a sort of Gutenberg-style press. Everything is changing so rapidly, and everyone wants rapid change in government. That's what they want. They want to see the government blown up and disrupted. Unfortunately for them, our founding fathers hated tyranny, and they built the government as a system of checks and balances, which makes it almost impossible to change very quickly. And as these rapid forces of change try to change this government that's essentially built not to change quickly, it's going to get very much worse before it gets better.
I'm so happy you say that, because this is exactly what happened to the Europeans with Brexit. Mm-hmm. All the traditional media got it wrong. Mm-hmm. A lot of people went to sleep the evening before Brexit thinking that it would be tight, but it would be fine. Mm-hmm. Everybody underestimated the anger and the willingness to turn out of those who see themselves as losing out from globalization. Mm-hmm. And I think this is what we have mostly in common. This is what I found out over the last couple of days. Are we going to be able, the mainstream parties, and yes, then we're in that together despite our differences, are we going to find an answer to this now black and white opposition between unbridled globalization and those who say, no, I've had enough? And the first thing that we need is the recognition of our interdependence among citizens in a country to start with. As a politician, I'm very worried about the fact that I see that the higher income, higher education groups are the ones that turn out for European elections and the others are not. As a politician, you should never find that divide acceptable. And then secondly, between countries of the EU, yes, and in this transatlantic relationship that we have. And to answer your question, what is one of the elements that we might actually, one of the instruments we should maybe use more? Definitely the transatlantic legislators dialogue, because you mentioned trade. On the issue of trade, once you start talking and have the channels of communication open, you find out that the fears and the uncertainty surrounding TTIP is exactly the same in Europe as it is in the US. We don't trust your food standards and you don't trust ours. Well, that recognition in itself is a start of trying to resolve that issue, because we're coming from the same insecurities and fears. Well, that's one. Second is, how do we address that? So this transatlantic legislators dialogue, I think, is very, very important. And secondly, when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State and her visits brought her to Brussels, what she did was take 1 hour out of her very, very busy schedule, and she came to the European Parliament. Not to speak to the members of Parliament, you're nodding, you might remember this, not to speak to the members of Parliament who are absolutely upset, but to speak to about 200 young staffers in the European Parliament. I was one of these staffers. Luckily, I wasn't a member of Parliament yet, so I got to meet her. And doing things like that has such an amazing impact, talking to these 200 staffers. I'm so grateful that she did. I think that it helped immensely. She talked to people from the communist group all the way to the right side of the political spectrum in the European Parliament. And I think she would absolutely be a fantastic president. One last remark about Angela Merkel, who happens to be my European hero as well. Her role will be very, very important in this group, let's hope we will get there, of what Madeleine Albright today in the meeting called the three amigas. If we get the three amigas, so May and Merkel and hopefully President Clinton, if we get there, Mrs. Merkel's role will be immensely important in order to get the Europeans all noses pointing in the right direction. Because with May out and France rather less committed to the Franco-German axis, it will be her role not only to engage with America and the UK, but to actually keep the Europeans together. She can do it. This is why she's a very careful, analytic woman. But as soon as she thinks, and some people sometimes believe that she thinks for too long, but when she talks, it's always spot on, and she will have definitely a majority of people behind her. So her role will be, in that group of three, also very, very crucial for bringing Europe together.
We could add a fourth as well. Federica Mogherini
Absolutely.
is another woman. Ambassador, I wonder how do you think that role can grow in such what we could call hopefully an Amiga quartet?
It's becoming bigger and bigger. Great.
I think it can make a difference. I mean, I think the friendship between, say, Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State and Cathy Ashton was very productive at that time. So yes, I think having a number of women in very influential and powerful roles can certainly change the dynamic. And speaking as an endangered species, the male, I heartily welcome it. I think it's something, and I think it's absolutely. I mean, I don't know how this election is going to turn out in the United States, and unlike Mr. Pittella, I have to be strictly non-partisan. But I thank Mr. Pittella for taking a strong view on his behalf. I don't know how this is going to turn out, but I think it is a very. I mean, the only question I would ask is, why has it taken so long? And I would say the same thing in Europe. Why has it taken so long, with all that we've known, for women to really come to power in positions, and also, as Jay was saying, in the area of business and commerce, if you like watching an episode of Mad Men and going back and seeing how things were in the 60s, and we have come a long way, as the famous cigarette ad at one point used to say, but on the other hand, it has taken much longer than it should have. So I think this is a really very welcome development globally, and I hope we will see more of it.
Thank you. We have a little over 25 minutes left, so I think now would be a good moment to turn this to the audience. Do we have someone holding mics, or if you could raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, please state who you are and where you come from, and whether the question is one to the panel as a whole or to a specific individual on the panel.
Yes, thank you. My name is Gerald Levin. I'm an economist and a registered investment advisor. I'm not one of the delegates. And here's my question, please. Multiculturalism, as applied to non-EU immigrants into EU countries, could you please precisely define what various European countries mean by that, what you hope to accomplish from it, what you consider to be a success, what you consider to be a failure, and an example of a specific success or failure in various European countries?
Okay, so it's a big question. So I wouldn't want to. I'll take a first shot, and then maybe a couple of our European friends. I mean, I think it's impossible to define multiculturalism, but I would say that one of the things that we have to recognize as a modern society is that diversity is a strength, not a weakness. That we prosper, and in a modern economy where creativity and innovation is often the driving force of economic growth, I think the more diverse a society, the more influences that these societies have on each other, the greater the opportunity for that. You look at places like Silicon Valley, it's one of the most diverse places in the world, it's one of the most dynamic. But I think underpinning that, we have to be very clear about what the core set of European values are and the expectations and hopes that we have for new Europeans. And like you can look at a country like Canada, it's incredibly successful. I think that's a model that we should all aspire to in terms of how they do their politics, how they engage, and how they treat new Canadians, and how they are immediately welcomed in and allowed to thrive. So I think that's an example that Europeans can look at, but I don't know, Esther, if you wanted to say a few words on that too.
Well, the problem with this quite loaded term of multiculturalism is that it has become it has been translated into a lot of European debates into de facto absolute individualism. What a lot of people mean when they criticize multiculturalism, and even the great Angela Merkel that I just cited, has actually been known for saying multiculturalism is dead. I mean, that's quite the remark. She has made it. And she has made it because what it has become to mean. It has become to mean, unfortunately, a situation in which you are not living together in a society, certain groups next to each other, with each other, but actually allowing people to come as migrants like we did in my country in the 1960s to do the jobs that needed doing when we had the Wirtschaftswunder and the economy was going well. Allowing and actually needing people into our country, but then not making sure that we had sufficient integration to form a society together. So it was a society of everybody next to each other rather than everybody with each other. And this is, I think, the harsh lesson that we have had to learn in Europe. I'm happy that a lot of politicians have learned it. I'm, of course, not talking about the Donald Trumps and the Geert Wilderses of this world. They have not learned this lesson, but our big challenge now, facing the biggest migration situation that we have seen since the Second World War, is how do we make sure, first of all, that we, and I agree with you, keep our values high, so that we do respect the international treaties there are when it comes to protecting refugees. Secondly, to make sure that once we allow people into our country on the basis of these treaties, we actually don't just put them somewhere and forget about them, but make sure that we actually make sure we form a society with each other rather than against each other or absolutely next to each other. This is a big challenge, but once the realization is there that this is the way it has to be done, we need to tackle it that way. And I want to go away from just defining this concept because in every member state, in every political debate, it might mean something slightly different. What I'm much more interested in is how do we make sure, knowing that our societies are going to be more diverse than they were before, knowing that we have more experience with migration in Italy and in the Netherlands than Eastern European countries do. I'm not defending those Eastern European prime ministers who have said we want to see zero migrants or we shall only allow Christian migrants into their country. That has been said in Europe as well. I'm not defending that at all. But I can see that a country, small Eastern European country, might have a little bit less experience than we do in the Netherlands. And therefore, I do support the fact that the European Commission has proposed to tackle this biggest migration crisis we have ever seen in a joint way. And in that regard, maybe the Netherlands needs to take on a bigger responsibility than some of the Eastern European member states that are learning. But they need to learn, and let's work on this together.
Thank you.
Thank you. Todd Tucker. I work at the Roosevelt Institute, where I lead a program on trade and economic governance. This is a question for Gianni and for Esther. As Jay was mentioning earlier, there has been a lot of consternation this week among some in the Democratic Party over the TPP and also, not as mentioned as much, but also TTIP. What do you think that those protesters and those members of the party are getting wrong or getting right when it comes to trade policy and to TTIP? And how are you dealing with these factors back at home?
Johnny, do you want to take a first stab at that?
But I think that the trade, international trade, is essential. We cannot stop the change, the commercial change between the countries. And I think that TTIP can be a great opportunity, but we have to clarify some things. First of all, we have to defend the social, health, environmental standards. Secondly, we have to involve the citizens. Frankly speaking, now the public opinion in Europe is against TTIP, the majority. And we cannot go home, go forward without the majority of the people. So we have to clarify very well the standards, defending and protecting the consumers and the citizens. We have to explain this to our people. We have to involve them in all the process, and then we can reach the goal. This is my view.
Well, TTIP, looking at it from the European side, risks becoming, I'll talk content later, but risks becoming this symbol for this isolationist tendency that I was speaking about before. I wish we would discuss TTIP and all the other treaties in all openness, in all honesty, and like Gianni says, with the public. Because if we don't, and if we don't actually talk, so what's your concern? What's mine? How can it be addressed? The fact that the dispute settlement system had to be revised under European pressure by the European Commission. I mean, these are, we can have a whole debate about this topic, and we're not there yet on a lot of issues. But first of all, we need to take it away from just being the symbol of isolationism. We need to talk content, what are the concerns? And then maybe the problem has also been in the past that these trade agreements have been so broad, so extremely broad. If we went by it sector by sector, it's more complicated, but it's less complicated, but it takes more time. But it could be a way of addressing the issues one by one. I've been an agriculture spokesperson for 7 years. Now I'm on the Economic Affairs Committee, so I'm dealing with banking and financial institutions. And those are two completely different areas, yet they both concern TTIP to a large extent. And if you speak to a farmer, they will say, well, how come I have to fulfill certain criteria in order to produce in Europe? And then there's product X, meat, milk, coming in from another part of the world which didn't have to fulfill those criteria. That's unfair. I'm already not making a living with what I produce. In the insurance sector, people are concerned that actually free trade in certain areas will make the Dutch insurance system impossible and will intervene into a system that we would like to actually design by ourselves. We don't even have a European system for that. So let's address these issues and make sure, because trade is a good thing. I come from a tiny country. We wouldn't survive without trade. Trade is a good thing, but only under the right conditions. So let's talk conditions and let's not make this a symbol.
Julian, I'd like to bring you in on that just a little bit. Trump has touted the idea that the US under his administration might leave the WTO, and the politics of trade are toxic, to say the least, on both sides of the political ledger here. What is it about the politics of trade at the moment that makes it so hard to basically convince people what is self-evident in the Netherlands, that trade is a good thing?
Yeah, but if we had a referendum, I think a majority at the moment, I'm quite honest, would vote against.
I think so. I suspect it's the same here.
No,
so how do we move out beyond this
absolutely.
point?
I mean, this is just a surreal moment for Americans, particularly those that have paid any attention to our politics in recent years. I mean, we have the Republican candidate essentially calling into question the utility of free trade. And that in itself is bizarre, but it's paired with the same sentiment on the left. So we now have this common thread that's running through both sides of the political spectrum, you know, total disaffection with globalization, loss of faith in international institutions, loss of faith in governance in general, complete loss of faith in Washington, clearly. But it all runs together, this open-ended question about, you know, are we getting a fair deal? You know, and Trump, without putting any specifics behind it, really has built on that sentiment and seized on it to say, I'm here for you. I'll open up all of these debates. I'll call into question all of these international institutions, commitments, treaty commitments, everything we've spent 70 years constructing. He's essentially taking a shot at the liberal order, whether it's in the trade and economic sphere or in the security sphere. And so we've got a lot of work to do, and what I worry about is even if we see Hillary Clinton get elected, we will have to spend years it's almost like Trade 101, going back to basics, making the case, educating our publics while they are extremely skeptical about the benefits of free trade, and trying to explain why we have the system we have. Why have we built these set of institutions? What do we get out of it? Right now there's a lot of mythology and blame, and people feel like they can't keep up. It's a very complex environment full of nuance, and it's easy to say we want out and we want a better deal, which is Trump's brand. And without saying what that better deal actually looks like, people are clearly buying into it. And again, it's not just Trump. We see evidence of this in Europe. We see across multiple parties as well, and certainly here across our own political spectrum. So this challenge will be with us. And whoever wins the election here and multiple elections across Europe in the coming years, this will be an ongoing part of our transatlantic project, is trying to help our publics understand what the case is for free trade and these institutions that go along with it.
And we will be the ones that will have to come up with the answer that Trump is not giving.
Right.
He's saying, I'll give you a better deal. I've heard this week, it was great, by the way, and thank you for the great program that we've had and for inviting us on this panel. But I've heard a lot, also from the Democratic side, of criticism at the person, Donald Trump, which I 100%, 101% understand. But if we leave it at the level of, oh, look how awful Donald Trump is, we're not giving the answers to the questions that the people are asking. We're criticizing, I'm already seeing myself on your side, but we're criticizing him for saying, I'll fix it, but not giving the answer. But at the same time, we're not giving it either. And this is a European thing. We, the mainstream middle ground parties in the EU, and I think you have the same challenge. Recognizing that part of this criticism and frustration of people might be legit. And what is then actually the answer that you're going to give, which is a responsible answer, unlike what Donald Trump is doing. We've had this very difficult discussion about enlargement, and for years it was impossible to criticize enlargement in the EU. You know, remember 1989, we were all crying out of joy, so was I, when the Berlin Wall came down. So it was only right that new member states joined the EU. Romania and Bulgaria, I'm sorry if I'm offending people from those countries, joined the EU too early. This was impossible. I'm not saying they're not European countries, but it might have been better for us and for them to join a bit later. It was impossible to say this for years and years in the EU because you were not supposed to criticize the European project. I think part of the answer of regaining the credibility of our citizens is also to fairly and squarely admit that some things were done wrong, and then provide the answers of how we will do things better in the future. But you need, I might sound very Greek now, or Latin, or very Southern European at least, but you need a form of catharsis before you regain the credibility of your voters. And that catharsis comes through actually also admitting what we did wrong and how we will address those issues.
And you raise a very good point. Don't get me wrong. This isn't just about explaining kind of history and the benefits, but it is about listening to the other side, because there are legitimate concerns. There has been a lack of transparency in some cases, and there are reasons why we need to try and meet folks halfway. So this is not, you know, I don't want to be too simplistic in saying it's just a history lesson, and it's not. It's more than that. But I do think that there's some misunderstanding about the benefits that come from free trade. So I'm completely with you on that.
I do want to give the other panelists an opportunity to come in here as well. And I'm not trying to break up this dialogue. I think it's fantastic. But I've also spotted out of the corner of my eye that we have the Swedish Minister for Trade and European Affairs, Ann Linde, there. So this might be an appropriate moment for you to ask your question. Whether or not it builds on this issue, I'm not sure.
No, it's very, very interesting, but I also appreciate the possibility for dialogue and question. Yes, as Matt said, I'm the Minister of EU and Trade in the Swedish government, and I would like to hear a little bit more about the consequences of Brexit. And I would like to point out three different things. One is that Julianne said that we really have to have both relations from the US with EU, but also bilateral. And everybody knows that there has been always a certain relation between UK and USA. Will Brexit means that there will now be a stronger bilateral relation and a weaker EU-US relation with this? The second comment on this is that I heard from some of our trade negotiators that some have said after Brexit that now it might not be as interesting for us to have a really good TTIP if UK is not there, because UK is so big part of the trade and economy. And would that mean that it would be lesser understanding from the American side on the demands from the European side in the coming rounds of the TTIP negotiation? And finally, a comment on this is today the British new minister was in Washington and said that he now saw that there is a golden opportunity for Britain to have a bilateral trade agreement between UK and USA, and that would be much better than the EU-US trade. He immediately got reaction both from Downing Street number 10, who said that that was not yet the position of the British government, because that might be another position from the British government, even if he is minister, and from Michael Froman, who is the US trade representative, who said that he was not prepared to start negotiation with UK before they have even left the EU. So it seems like already there is a lot of complication, there is a lot of possible ways forward, and it would be very, very interesting to hear both from the American side, from the EU side, and from the British part of the panel, what kind of consequences you see. And it would be interesting to hear a little bit of your speculation, since we are in a closed room and everybody is friends, to see what can we what can we expect of this.
I think it might
Thank
be
you
being
very much.
taped, but anyway, that's I'm
No
sure it's
matter.
Chatham House. I will say one quick thing, and I won't say more because if I start on Brexit, I won't finish. But I would be very careful to believe anything that Brexiteer ministers say, because the people who've advocated for Brexit have lived in their own little dream world for a very long time in terms of what we'll be able to negotiate and what kind of relationships we'll be able to build. So that's all I will say on that matter. Ambassador, do you want to come in?
Well, I mean, obviously the politicians will wish to speak, but I mean, just a couple of observations. I mean, first of all, I fully understand that on the U.S. side, one of the arguments is, well, you know, it's like taking California out of the U.S., so the whole deal is worth a bit less, so you have to ask for less. It's a good negotiating stance. I understand it, and there are answers to it. I think the first thing we should really say, however, is that we're still negotiating at 28. That is the situation until such time as the UK leaves. And the UK has not even applied to leave yet. And that's not to say that they will not. That's not to say that in due course they will leave. I'm not disputing that. But it could take several years. And frankly, I don't know if we will succeed in concluding TTIP this year. I think it's difficult, but I know Cecilia Malmström and Mike Froman are going to try. But if we can't, I still think it's something which for me is a sort of another 18 months time needed perhaps to finalize the negotiations. It's still at 28. So I think we need to continue on the basis of 28. We will see where we get to with Brexit. There are options. You could have a separate trade agreement with the UK, but the UK has a long way to go before they can start negotiating a free trade agreement with anyone. They have to extricate themselves from the European Union, and they have to, if I may use a clumsy phrase, re-implicate themselves in the WTO. They basically have to negotiate a whole new arrangement in Geneva with 160 countries to even begin to get their baseline tariff schedules. And those of us who are familiar with the shark den that is Geneva know that 160 countries will make it not easy to negotiate that. So there are many things, many hurdles which the UK has to jump before they get there. And as Cecilia Malmström said when she was in Washington recently, we have also imagined TTIP as an open platform. In other words, we always thought Turkey might be the beneficiary of the fact that it could be an open platform as TPP is. There is no reason why you could not, conceptually, have the UK as part of TTIP while at the same time no longer being a full member of the EU in due course. So I think the UK also has to decide whether its best interests are served by having a separate bilateral agreement 5 or 10 years from now, because frankly these things will take time. I don't believe in fast trade negotiations. Or whether it might not be still interesting to be in some way associated with a successful transatlantic deal if we can make that breakthrough this year or in a year or two later.
So I just looked at my watch, and I had promised that we would try and wind this panel up at about 7:15, so I've already missed that target, I'm afraid. So what I'm proposing is I'm going to allow everybody on the panel to have one last 15 to 30 second intervention in which you can answer your views on the impact of Brexit, or you can alternatively propose what you think would be a great idea for the or hope and aspiration you have for the transatlantic relationship going forward. And I'm going to start with you, Jane.
These nationalisms and this sort of populism ignites, and what it results in. And we were supposed to do this pivot to Asia like 8 years ago, and it's totally never happened. And so, and I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. I hate to break it to Asia, but I think it's there's the Chinese curse. May you live in interesting times. And as a journalist, I think we are definitely living in interesting times.
Thank you.
Just on the Brexit question, I mean, I do think it's far too soon to get into the if-then clauses, and it's hard to wrap your head around it. I think one thing I can say, though, with certainty is that I've yet to meet anyone in D.C. that believes that it will end up being a zero-sum game, so that if we put added emphasis on our bilateral relationship with the UK, it comes at a cost for Brussels. I can't see that. There's too much at stake in our relationship with Brussels, and even without the UK, it's a tremendous value to the United States on all fronts. And so, yes, we will invest in the UK relationship, and the UK is eager to deliver the message to Washington that they want to do the same. But, we'll have to see. We don't know what state their economy is going to be in. We don't know how much we can rely on the security relationship because defense spending might come into play at some point, depending on what happens. So there are just countless, endless questions to be answered. We'll take this one day at a time. The truth is we don't have anything to point to. People keep pointing, oh, well, there's the Norwegian model. I don't think that applies. There's Canada's trade relationship with the EU. I don't know if that's going to help us. Switzerland has a unique play. I mean, nothing really fits. We have not gone through the motions of this, either from Brussels' perspective or from all of the folks that sit in London. And so we literally, unfortunately, are going to have to live this day by day. But Washington and this administration's in no rush. They've been quick to message our friends in London to say, get in the queue. There's a lot going on. This won't be the top priority. We're not going to, break ground on some new trade agreement within weeks, particularly since we haven't even gotten to Article 50 yet. So there's so much work to be done and so much that we don't know that I think we can easily get ahead of ourselves, and we should avoid that temptation along the way.
I'm unfortunately going to skip the Brexit question because I'd be too long. I was so happy when yesterday on this stage I heard Howard Dean say, we share these great values, and you might call them American values, or we might call them European values, but the fact that we stand up for the freedom of speech, or that we cannot tolerate certain developments in the world where journalists will just be put into jail for what they write about Erdogan or whomever, these values are being threatened. And we share these values. So the only thing that we can do as Americans and Europeans is to work together, even if the tide might be against us, but to show that we have some spine and actually keep living according to these values, not only at home, but also worldwide. And I was given a poster to hold up yesterday which said stronger together. I think these are the two words that should apply and should continue to apply to the transatlantic relationship.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. The first outcome of the Brexit has been that the United Kingdom is no more united. Immediately, the day after, Scottish people don't want to leave. The City of London does want to leave. Northern Ireland does want to leave. This is a disaster. My recommendation to you is to avoid a new disaster in USA. Vote with, my recommendation is to vote with the mind, not with the stomach. Because with your vote, you decide the future. Not only your future, the future of your children, the future of your grandson, and the future of the entire world. And so I ask you to strongly support Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton. And ask myself, and ask Esther, and ask Sweden minister, and ask Knut Fleckenstein, and the other German, Slovenian. Here, many Italians live. Here, many German people live, Spanish, and others. We have to campaign also in our communities. I already made my campaign with the Italian community to convince them that for the interest of the Italian community, they have to vote Hillary Clinton.
Thanks, Gianni, for not politicizing this panel.
I am a politician. If I don't do this...
It's all fine by me. Ambassador.
Well, in keeping with the non-partisan nature of this panel, I'm very happy to let Mr. Patella have the last word.
Well, look,
final and good word. Huh? You agree? You cannot say, but you agree.
For those of you tweeting, I made no comment.
Okay. Well, on that note, let's not try and top that. Could you all join me in thanking the panelists for what I thought was a wonderful discussion?